George, thank you for accepting our invitation to be on Canadian Perspective.
Thank you, Sam.
I've always been fascinated by Nova Scotian politics and history. I remember when Robert Stansfield, the former premier, once confided to the then Senator Oliver about the lack of diversity and the lack of diversity reflection that wasn't being reflected in Nova Scotia. And then I found out about you and your books and your work and so on, and I became fascinated by Nova Scotia. So if you can reflect on the history, the Black Nova Scotian history, and your own biography, and tell us who you are then.
Well, I really appreciate the question, and I have to say I have a lot of respect for the late Robert Stansfield, because he was the premier who ended school segregation. Progressive conservative premier who ended school segregation in Nova Scotia in the mid-1950s once he became premier. And he, of course, in his career had a lot of connection with Black Nova Scotians, because there was a big community in Truro, which is the place where he was from, Truro, Nova Scotia. But to come to the other part of your question about background and history, et cetera, I think that Black Nova Scotia, and I often refer to it as Africadia, and refer to myself as Africadian, because I like to have the capital letters there, et cetera. I think it's really essential for all Canadians to know that history, because it makes the point that there were never only two founding peoples, as some like to think, English and French, founded Canada. Well, Canada always existed long before there were English or French settlers here, for one thing. And we cannot forget First Nations or Indigenous peoples, first of all. So we want to talk about founding peoples. They are the first founders, the First Nations, and so on. And then Europeans start arriving. But right along with the Europeans, there were Africans immediately, because we know that, for instance, a translator who arrived with Samuel Champlain, 1605, was in fact Black, Portuguese, Samuel da Costa. And so if you want to date the founding of New France, or Quebec for that matter, to 1605, you got to add a Black person there as well. And so you cannot, and we know that slavery began in New France right away, 1608. There's a record of a slave, a Black slave, in what is now Quebec. So you can't even in Quebec, you can't even talk about we're Pure land and we're a Quebecois de souche, where we have the roots going way back, and pretend that it's only that can only apply to white Quebecois of Francophone descent. Absolutely not. You got to include some Black people in there too, because they were there right along with the Europeans as slaves, for crying out loud, helping to construct New France. So come back to the Nova Scotian story. Samuel da Costa actually arrived in Nova Scotia 1605, along with Champlain and Port Royal, et cetera, Annapolis Royal today. Fast forward 150 years to the mid-18th century. The Acadians were deported by the British to allow the Yankees to come in and take up the lands that had been farmed by the Acadians. And when the Yankees arrived from New England and from the South, they brought more Africans with them as their slaves. And so by mid-18th century, you had hundreds of people of African descent in Nova Scotia. Fast forward a couple of decades, and you're into the 1780s. This is the era of the American Revolution. So then you have the Loyalists arriving to what is now Canada, but arriving mainly to Nova Scotia, and that was 30,000 people. But 10% of that number were Black. So if you want to talk about Canada was founded by the Loyalists, fine, you can make that ridiculous argument or claim, but you better make room for the fact that 10% of that number were Black people who supported the British struggle against America, because they wanted their freedom, which is what the British promised them, freedom and land in Nova Scotia. Keeping in mind it wasn't their land to give, but they were still promising it anyway. So to make a long story short, by the late 18th century, you got 3,500 at least African people in Nova Scotia. Fast forward, they were treated so badly, hit the fast forward again, 1792, a third of that number goes back to Africa, to what is now Sierra Leone. So there's a strong connection between Canada and Sierra Leone because of that Nova Scotian migration back to Africa in 1792. Fast forward again, you've got the War of 1812 to 1815, and we're now 200 years later, and as a result of that war, 2,200 Black people again support the British side side and come to Nova Scotia between 1812 and 1815. And that's really the end of the major migrations to Nova Scotia. But that gives Nova Scotia then one of the largest, up until the 1960s, the largest Black Canadian population.
Yeah, I mean, going back to my grade 10 history, I remember when we learned about the Ukrainians. Mostly they did farming in this country, and the Chinese, the railroad and so on. What did the Black people do in Nova Scotia? Like, what did define them? What was the signature of the Black story?
Essentially, for 200 years, it was dirt cheap labor. Which was reinforced. I mean, the low socioeconomic position and class position and prestige position of blacks in Nova Scotia was reinforced by a lack of access to high quality education, which itself was reinforced by the de facto practice of segregation, but just also various state moves that were made by the colonial government and then the provincial government when Canada came into existence, which perpetuated the position of black Nova Scotians as an underclass, as a reserve of cheap labor. And that was also a function of the immigration system as well, in terms of particular kinds of immigrants coming to Canada or wanted to come to Canada. So Asian, particularly Chinese, black, of course, up until the early 20th century, were constructed to be cheap labor. So that's why Chinese are brought in to build the railway, because they will build it cheaply. Yeah. And it's okay if dozens or hundreds or thousands die, it's all right. It's not going to affect the votes for white politicians in Confederation era Canada, right? And as soon as railway is built, then laws are constructed to try to force or compel Chinese to leave. Blacks are tolerated in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, again as farmers on the prairies, when some began to arrive in the early 20th century, late 19th century, to take up what was described as free land. But of course, the government of Canada really wanted Eastern European folks to settle on the prairie. So when black Americans began to arrive, fleeing the Ku Klux Klan in places like Oklahoma and Alabama, it was a shock to Albertans, and they demanded that immigration laws be changed to forbid black people from being able to immigrate to Canada. And in fact, they were changed, and in fact, blacks were barred from entering Canada, effectively barred for the most part between 1905 and 1955. For 50 years, blacks were discouraged, or you just outright prevented from immigrating to Canada.
I mean, I don't remember, obviously, but that happened. I'm reading about it in 1908 under the Liberal Laurier government. But I mean, I remember recently reading about John Ham, the Premier of Nova Scotia, and how much he wanted to be inclusive, the education system of Nova Scotia to be inclusive. And I remember setting aside affirmative action kind of seats for trustees, black trustees, to be involved. And I also remember a Liberal Premier criticizing the law school accepting black students and discounting their achievement as if it was attained by affirmative action or a lower standard. So what's your reflection on it?
That's a big question, a big comment right away, and I have to say that affirmative action, first of all, we usually describe it in Canada as employment equity. All right, that's our version of it, and that's really important to recognize, because employment equity, that is to say affirmative action, is guaranteed, defended in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Constitution. The Constitution, the fundamental law of the country, says it's okay to create special programs to address imbalances and disadvantaged populations. And so it's disingenuous for folks to come along and say, this is reverse discrimination, this is wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's also a racist element of this, which is to claim that people who benefit from some kind of employment equity must necessarily be less talented, less gifted, less capable than someone else. When really the whole purpose of affirmative action employment equity is to correct the racist denial of opportunity to others who are not part of the mainstream. And that's why it's attacked, because it's trying to address that imbalance. And we have to recognize the fact that there's always been affirmative action for able-bodied white males. Always. They've always had their affirmative action in terms of setting up their particular companies and firms, et cetera, and saying that they're going to employ the sons and nephews, or sometimes daughters and nieces of friends of theirs, people they went to school with, the private clubs, the golf club buddies, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how their affirmative action has always worked, right? In terms of them being part of a buddy system, knowing each other, the old boys network, et cetera, et cetera. Affirmative action / employment equity is an attempt to interrupt that circle of inbreeding, inbred hiring, incestuous employment, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we should call it. We should call it incestuous employment. Affirmative action is actually about breaking up the incest, economic incest, and making it possible for there to be fresh blood, fresh ideas, more capable people who aren't simply there because they're related to so-and-so who has a membership in a particular religious group or entertainment of a sports franchise, et cetera, et cetera. And again, that's why it's attacked. And I think people need to defend it and be proud about defending it because of the fact that it is part of the constitutional bedrock of the country. You cannot have real equality unless there's real equality of opportunity. You got to have real equality of opportunity in order to have real equality politically, economically, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what it's all about. So whenever folks raise hackles or say, oh, we can't find somebody who's qualified for that position, that's why there are no women, that's why there are no blacks, that's why there are no Native people, et cetera. I was like, you didn't look because you didn't want to.
But your fascination with Trudeau and the fact that you find him fascinating and he happens to be a hero of yours. Immigrants who look like me always give Trudeau and the Liberals credit for bringing us to this country. I didn't know Kam when he was Prime Minister, but many people that are a bit older than me always credit him for that achievement, especially the immigration file. What's your fascination with Trudeau? Is it the human rights, the fact that he seems to protect minority rights? Like, what is it about Trudeau?
Well, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, from everything I know about him and from the record of legislation, for crying out loud, recognize, and I think this is really important, even though he was born 1918, and one could say that, okay, he's from a generation that still might have had a lot of backward ideas, et cetera, about different kinds of people, and so on. The great advantage for him is that he traveled. He traveled. So he traveled around the world, 1948, 49. He was in the Middle East. He was in China. He was in India. At a time, he was in the Soviet Union when there was a Soviet Union. He went to a lot of places where people say you're not supposed to go, or you shouldn't be associating with so and so, and such and such. And I think that gave him a great cosmopolitan outlook and intelligence. And that's one reason why he was so opposed to Quebec nationalism, and particularly in terms of its trying to become an independent state, because he was worried that an independent Quebec would not preserve minority rights. He might have been wrong about that. On the other hand, he certainly maintained that principle in terms of looking at how society should function in general. And he believed, I think strongly, that Canada would be at its best when it had a real diversity in its population, and thereby become a beacon and a guiding light and a great example to the rest of humanity, that it is possible to bring together many different kinds of people under a government that respects and defends human rights and civil liberties, et cetera, and to have a great economy, great wealth generated to benefit the entire society. this is simply a progressive vision, absolutely. And it is telling to me, striking to me, we have not had a prime minister since who has been able to represent that same kind of vision outward. In fact, to me, Barack Obama is a kind of Pierre Trudeau, but the Pierre Trudeau of America. I mean, to turn things around a little bit. You know, if you look at his background and his story, it's a little bit Trudeauvian, and particularly the election campaigns in 1968 compared with 2008 Obama's campaign. There are a lot of parallels there, and so I do think of them both as being very progressive politicians who understood that it is essential to defend diversity. Because you have to ask yourselves, who benefits from prejudice? Who benefits from marginalizing whole groups of people? Who benefits from that? Well, it's got to be very few. It's got to be the very few, the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, who benefit by basically trying to grab more wealth for themselves, as opposed to letting more of it circulate and give more people a better quality of life. I'm okay with folks being billionaires and millionaires. I'm okay with that, so long as they pay their taxes, and so long as they're not trying to prevent other people from enjoying the benefits available to them in this society. And the only way that masses of people can be prevented from having fulfilling and rewarding lives and careers in the society is if other folks are deliberately repressing them.
You know, 1967, when Lincoln Alexander was chosen as an MP, he was a noted, I think, the first black MP from Hamilton. And when Rosemary Brown decided to run for leadership in 1975, she really believed she had a chance until the unions came out and supported Ed Broadbent. You spent some time with the NDP and you worked with a noted MP from Windsor. Well, how was it like? Why not the NDP?
Oh my golly. Oh, Sam, these are good questions, I have to say. Excellent questions. I'll begin on the personal basis. My kindergarten teacher was Alexa McDonough, who later was the leader of the Nova Scotia NDP and the federal NDP. So I've got NDP connections in my blood, so to speak. And one of my unfortunately late great uncle, Jack White, ran for the old CCF in 1962 here in Toronto. He didn't win, but he was a member of the CCF NDP and labor leader and ran for that party. And so in my family background, there's been a lot of allegiance, I guess I can say, for the New Democratic Party and for the idea of social democracy and democratic socialism and so on and so forth. And my only complaint is the usual complaint that people on the left would have about the NDP, which is, I wish the NDP could be even more left. I would be more comfortable if the party were openly further left. I have, you know, I have a good job, I earn a good salary, so I know I'm in a good position, safe position maybe, to be able to say that I am a leftist, and I believe in democratic socialism, and I'd like to support a party that believes the same thing I believe. And right now, I don't see any party that does, including the NDP. Unfortunately.
When Alexa was MLA in Nova Scotia, she was the only one. Then I remember she departed to Ottawa in '97, replaced by a young guy, and he left, and Drexler became premier. You must have been disappointed with the NDP. And the black relationship, not even saying sorry for the misgiving that happened before, having to wait for the Liberals to take over and do the right thing.
Again, these are really good questions, and I don't want to criticize anyone out of hand, because I know it's difficult. It's extremely difficult to run a government, especially when you're trying to balance the books and make sure you don't upset investors, et cetera, who are lending the province money and so on to pay its bills. And Nova Scotia, the government of Nova Scotia has been very good to me, and I appreciated a lot of the policies that have been put forward by various governments, Liberal, Conservative, and Darrell Dexter's NDP government. On the other hand, if I put on an objective cap for a moment and I look at the history of the NDP forming governments, for the most part, outside of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, maybe, when the NDP has formed governments in British Columbia, Ontario, and Nova Scotia, the same things have happened, which is basically that instead of being able to govern really and openly and explicitly for the benefit of the vast majority of Ontarians and Nova Scotians and British Columbians, what starts to happen is a kind of corrosion of principle, because of the demand or the felt need that they have to make sure that they placate business in some way, shape, or form, which is an incredible idea to me, because they'll never placate business. They never will. What business is going to say, increase my taxes? Even if in the end it's for the benefit of everybody, a better infrastructure, better education system. And why should they? I mean, they ought to be saying don't want to pay higher taxes. I agree. On the other hand, the NDP should be there to say it's not about higher taxes, it's about a better quality of life and better infrastructure for you so you can make more money in your business, for crying out loud. I wish we had governments that would make those kinds of arguments, but we don't. Instead, they run for cover. They say, oh my golly, we better not touch the taxes, as if the taxation system were fair as it is. It's not. So there's got to be some kind of rejigging of things, and you have to be a party. If you want public support, you got to be sure about what it is you want to do and stick to it. You know, I think that the Bob Rae NDP was in trouble the day they said we're not going to put beer and wine in corner stores. They were elected partly in the summer of 1990 because people were captivated by the idea, Ontarians were captivated by the idea they could be as mature as Quebecers and could handle the idea of going to the corner store and buying beer and wine. And the NDP caved immediately because of union pressure to say, oh, it's gonna cost us jobs. Instead of them saying, well, you know what, maybe we can expand. Maybe there can be more jobs. No one said they have to shut down the LCBO or the beer stores. The idea was that you spread more opportunity around for more people. That's how it should have been posed, as opposed to, oh, we're going to lose some jobs. No, we're going to create more jobs. But again, I'm making arguments they should have been making. But the bottom line here is that the Ontario NDP lost immediate support, and they also lost support around the idea of there being public auto insurance in this province. And there still should be public auto insurance in Ontario. And it was a promise, again, that helped them get elected in 1990 with a great majority in the face of what had been a very popular Liberal government led by David Peterson. But again, they gave in because insurance companies said they're going to cost jobs. And again, they could have said, you know what, we're going to need a public auto insurance body. We'll hire your folks to work in that agency to benefit all Ontarians and lower the cost of auto insurance. It's crazy that we pay the high bills that we do for auto insurance in this province. So, you know, again, my heart is you know, I want them to do the right thing. I like a lot of folks in the NDP, and I may or may not support the party politically again, and with donations, but I want a party that's unapologetically leftist, and they're not unapologetically leftist. They apologize. We're sorry we're on the left. Well, you got to be sorry for it. You didn't crash the global economy. You didn't do that in 2007, 2008. It was the fraudsters who did that.
You know, looking at the U.S., a few years after you attend your Ph.D., Toni Morrison saying Bill Clinton was the first black president. You spent some time at Harvard. Are they closer to having a black president at Harvard? Were you the only black face? Were you the very few black faces at Harvard?
Oh my golly! Again, Sam, where'd you get all these questions? Because they're fantastic. My golly!
They just elected a woman president a few years back.
Yeah, Drew Faust.
Who replaced Summers.
Yes. Look. The only thing I can say about Harvard is that it's such an elite institution, they make their own rules. They can do whatever they want because they have the capital to do it, right? So, you know, they'll have a black president or black whatever when they want to. And they can have it tomorrow or next year if they want to, and not suffer any consequences, no repercussions, because it's such a name brand institution, right? The benefit of a degree from Harvard, the benefit of a degree from Harvard is that you get the job interview. It doesn't matter, I mean, the fact that you have a great education too, but that piece of paper is going to get you that job interview. Whether you get the job or not is another question, but you're going to get your foot in the door.
Yeah.
That's for me, that's the real value of the Harvard education. Also, of course, it's a great university, blah 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 blah, and all that, and the African American students in particular are all, from my experience, extremely gifted, come with a great sense of purpose and knowledge of history, and the idea that they have opportunity that maybe no one in their family ever had before, and now they have it, and they are students filled with a great sense of purpose and drive to accomplish and get out there and change things. And hey, the first Black American president came from Harvard in part as well, so they also have that to look up to drive them forward. So I think that those kinds of changes will happen. On the other hand, they're also, relatively speaking, cosmetic, which is not to say there shouldn't be many more black students at Harvard. But I think that is coming, partly because of the fact that there are simply more middle class and upper middle class African Americans who can afford to make sure that their youth, their children, receive a good enough education in the first place to be able to apply for the scholarships if necessary, or because the family has accumulated enough capital already, they can just simply afford to send their son or daughter or children or all of them to Harvard. I'm not really answering your question very well, because really at the heart of it is the fact that as I started off talking about, in a sense, a kind of star system, they're very much, universities are based on a kind of star system. Yeah. And so Harvard will have a black president when that black president is already a star.
Yeah. But you spent, I think less than a year at Harvard.
Yes.
Reflect. I know you spent when you were at Harvard. Delta McGuinty was also either teaching or he was a fellow, I think.
He was there as a kind of, I think when he was there before I was appointed, and at that point he was teaching, but he was brought back. Now I don't remember the exact terms of his appointment, but I don't believe he was expected to teach. It was just simply a kind of an award. Yeah.
Was there any interaction? Did you meet him?
Oh yes. Well, we met a couple of times, and I asked him to give a talk in one of my seminars. I ran a seminar series, basically every second Monday or so, roughly, or roughly twice a month, and I'd have speakers in, and he was one of the speakers.
Yeah. You know, the fact was when Trudeau was a Ph.D. student, there was a big sign on his door saying, "I'm a citizen of the world." And a very fascinating story that I heard. But in terms of going back to Canada and our history, our politics, you know, we're a country that, you know, for the most part looked down on women, Canadian women. I mean, we had to wait a long, long time to accept the fact our sisters, our moms, were human beings. I mean, it happened in 1929, and the world welcomed the International Day of Women Rights in 1911, and we had to wait a long, long time before we even we had a woman prime minister for a moment, for less than a year, but she was chosen by the Progressive Conservatives. She wasn't elected by Canadians. So do you think, I mean, you're a young guy, you're only 55. I think,
Thank you.
Do you think in your lifetime or in my lifetime, would we see a woman, a black woman president? Or are we in Canada progressive only on a piece of paper?
A great question, once again. You know, when Barack Obama was elected, there were a lot of newspapers that had editorials that or comments that read something like, "It's about time. Like finally the Americans have gotten over race and racism, and here's the proof. They have elected a black American president." And I kept wondering, when are we going to see those newspaper articles about when will Canada have the first Native prime minister? When will Canada have a native governor general, which is a matter of appointment? The prime minister could appoint a native person to be governor general when the current governor general's term is up, right? So through the Queen. Again, that power of appointment. So why haven't we had a native governor general, an indigenous First Nations person to be governor general? I'm very happy. I was happy with Michael Jean, absolutely. The Right Honorable Adrian Clarkson as well, absolutely. I think these are really progressive, and David Johnston, the current governor general as well. Very happy. But at the same time, I think that we have a great debt that we owe to indigenous peoples in this country. And so why can't we have a native Canadian woman as our governor general? We're going to see, in my lifetime. It can only happen in my lifetime, presuming I have 15, 20 years to go, or at least. And I hope I have at least that. That can only happen if we as a society, as a people, the Canadian people, decide that we want that. That we want to be a society that is recognized for its diversity and its inclusiveness. But we haven't demonstrated that yet. We haven't gotten to that point where we are clamoring that we want to have prime ministers, plural, of color, that we want to have governors general and lieutenants governor, plural, of color, or from indigenous backgrounds. We have not clamored for that.
I mean, you talk about the importance of appointments. When the former lieutenant governor in Nova Scotia, the black woman, when she appointed,
Mayanne Francis,
complement the system, or is it just an appointment with no power?
No. Appointments are symbolic. They obviously are. But the problem with most appointments is that they're symbolic of the status quo. It's like, we want to let you know that we still have the power. So we're going to appoint someone who looks like us. Let you know, we still have the power here, folks. Nothing really has changed. So the benefit of appointments where you appoint someone who does not look visibly like the mainstream majority is that you're saying that there is room. There are possibilities for upward mobility, for crying out loud. It's symbolic, but it still sends an important message. You know, my daughter met Her Excellency, the Right Honorable Michael Jean, when she was Governor General. And I was really keen. I wanted my daughter to have that experience. Say, look, you know, here is a black woman who is constitutionally the head of state. When the Queen's not here, Michael Jean is the head of state. And so it was important for my daughter, I felt, to meet her. And to say, yeah, okay, and maybe you'll look back on it and say, Pop wasn't all bad because he got me to meet the Governor General, crying out loud. Yeah. And I'm teasing myself when I say that. So the symbolism is vital, because we like other kinds of symbols. It's important when Canadians achieve a victory in sports of some sort, and then it becomes a symbol of national achievement. That person, those athletes, become symbols of national achievement. So the symbolic import of appointments can never be discounted. For that matter, when are we going to have, you ask about prime ministers and governors general. What about Supreme Court members? When are we going to have a visible minority on the Supreme Court? We're very clear about 3 members need to be from Quebec or Francophone. We're very clear that there has to be at least a woman, if not more than one. No one has raised publicly the question of when are we going to have visible minorities on the Supreme Court of Canada, because there are going to be more and more cases that are going to involve race. Police treatment of minorities, for instance, those cases are going to come up more and more before the Supreme Court of Canada. I'd like there to be someone on the Supreme Court, at least one out of 9 judges, who has a background where they can say, I empathize and sympathize because I've been a victim of racial discrimination. Yeah. Right? So all these categories of power across the country need to be opened up. I don't want to hear any more talk about, oh, we're so multicultural and we're diverse. I know the subway is diverse in Toronto. I know the TTC is diverse in Toronto. I know that. I know when I walk into the bank, the tellers are going to be diverse. And why? Because it's mandated. Yeah. It's mandated by the federal government. The mandate that you got to have diversity in airlines, telecommunications, and banking. They mandated it. So we got diversity. I say mandate it in more places. Mandate it in more places. If it works in these industries, it'll work in all the others too.
Yeah. You know, when the Order of Ontario or the Order of Canada or the Order of Nova Scotia is given to, let's say, a 75-year-old, it's for something they've achieved in the past. But when they give it to someone like you, it's like giving the Rhodes Scholarship to you, which is the best is yet to come. So in maybe 10 years, where do you want to be as a Canadian and as an international Canadian who's traveled the world and who still wants to?
Sam, oh my golly, these are incredible questions. Well, I'm a writer, first of all, in my opinion. I'm a writer. I hope I'm not too bad a writer. And there are some books I want to write. And so in the next 10 years, I'd like to get a few more written. At least one more novel, 2 more novels maybe, more collections of poetry. I'd like to have another film made. I'd like to have another opera produced, and so on. So beyond that, and God willing, seeing my daughter settled in her life and career, and so on. Again, God willing, if I have that blessing, that would be really nice. I don't really know what else I should be asking for. Well, I mean, in terms of the society as a whole, I'd like Canadians to start voting their interests. I think it's silly that we're running around voting for parties that diminish us, that make us less than we are. That's silly. Why do you want to vote for somebody that's going to tell you that you're not as good as somebody else? You're not as good as America because they have this kind of system. You have a different kind of system. You have public health care, and they don't have quite the same kind of public health care, so their system's better than ours. I'm tired of that. Basically, in my opinion, that's what we get from the federal conservatives. Basically, Republican Party North. And they're all about saying, you don't want this, you can't have that. You don't want national daycare, you can't afford it. You don't want to have this, you can't afford it. You don't want to do this, you can't. Oh, well, we can go to war, though. Let's all go to war. We're not really sure what we're doing, but let's all go to war. I mean, people, wake up. Vote for your interests. Stop voting stupid. Vote for your interests, please.
But by November, you'll be your term as a poet laureate will be up. To the person, hopefully the woman or the young woman who will be taking over your position, what advice do you have for them? The advice that you wished you received 2.5 years ago.
Understand that, and I sort of did know this going in, but I got reminded about it about 1.5 years later. So I would really adamantly stress that even though you have civil servants who are very professional and very accomplished and charitable and kind, understand that the bureaucracy is still difficult to get anything done. So you need to start early, find out what it is that you can actually get done, and then do it. The mistake I made, I had a particular plan I wanted to get accomplished when I was appointed. And I attended a series of meetings with a series of folks who were all saying yes, yes, most likely yes, sure, yes. And then when the crunch came, which was last year, 2014, about, oh, can we now get this project started? Can we now do this? The answer came, no, not unless you have $600,000. Now, of course, I did not have $600,000, and I didn't know anybody who was going to give me $600,000. I would have much preferred if I hadn't gone to those meetings and hadn't had all those people saying yes, maybe, or probably, yes, we can. I would have preferred they just say, you give us $600,000, we can do it. If they'd said that at the very beginning, I would have said, I'll move on to another idea. Why waste time on something that I'm not going to be able to achieve? So it basically was a waste of my time, and that's what I felt bad about. It was a waste of my time. There are other things I can do. I can write a poem. I don't need to go to that meeting. Mm-hmm. It's nice to shake someone's hand, nice to have a cup of coffee, but I don't need to do that. I can stay home and write a poem. Mm-hmm. So I felt personally that it was just a waste of my time, when everybody knew at the end of the day the answer was going to be no. So tell me no up front. In fact, I've made it a point in many of my emails to folks to say, you know what, the best answer is no. If you can't say yes, just say no, and save myself some time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. This has been great.